All right, good morning, everybody. Yes, it's still morning. I had a really busy morning, but we're getting going here. Tara Bachland here with a Wifey Wake Up podcast. And here we go. Today I'm going to share with you why I chose to submit to my husband. And yes, it is a choice, and I think is a choice that a lot of women are not wisely making to strengthen their relationship and have a good operating relationship. So I'm going to share with you the reasoning that I had that I eventually came upon to actually decide to submit to my husband. And yeah, here we go. Because I hope that you women out there can come to the realization sooner than I did. So first of all, the word submit is not a 4-letter word. It is not the S word, okay? I think we have too many words in our society that have been hijacked, and this is why I like to look them up in the dictionary and actually understand them for myself, and not just understand them as society has redefined them. So to submit from Merriam-Webster is an intransitive verb. It is to yield oneself to the authority or will of another. To permit oneself to be subjected to something, as in to submit to surgery, or to defer to or consent to abide by the opinion or authority of another. Now, before you say that doesn't really make it sound much better, let's understand it in context. And perhaps even to take the sting out of the word, might add to it a little bit. Realize that you are in submission to more than you realize. We submit to the laws. We submit to our bosses, if you have a boss, and if we don't, we suffer the consequences, right? And depending on the severity to how much you decide to not submit is the degree that you'll suffer the consequences. Now, that's going to be different in each area. You even submit, for example, to social norms. So whether you cover your mouth or in your nose when you cough or sneeze, not spitting on the street, even the language that you use in a certain environment, you are submitting to the social norm or the environment. So realize that submission is not just submitting to a person, it's also submitting to an entity, the entity being a government, social constructs. And so we are really submitting on an everyday basis to much more than we actually realize. And if we take that into consideration, you realize that it's a common part of our way of life. And if the consequences are not always just the consequences of if you don't follow the law, for example, the consequences, even in the social construct, if we think about it in that manner, is that we would have an unruly society, right? Of course, we have laws to keep that order. But if we're just not considerate of other people, we have these social norms, we're going to live in a society that is out of order, or at least very disrespectful of one another. So we choose in one way or another to submit to these ways of being, whether it is a construct, something that is a concept, or an actual entity, an actual being like a person. So there's so much that I have to say on this topic, and I'm going to do my best to give you the highlights because there, like I said, is so much to cover. But first of all, I want you to realize that, especially women out there, guys are pretty they know that there is hierarchy, structure, reason to put things into order, rather than just allow them to be chaotic. They might be rebellious, the quintessential teen, right? The rebellious teen, and especially the male pushing the limits, but that's to find where the boundaries are. And we need to have a healthy balance between striving to keep the order and also allow some creativity, i.e. chaos, to happen in life. So here we go. Here are some of the highlights. 1, I want you to realize that when you marry someone, you have the choice. You are choosing to be with them. I chose to be with my husband. I trusted him enough to be in life, to give my life, to become one, and to create life together. And so if that isn't the highest on the highest level of importance, then what do you have, right? It is already the utmost importance. So submission is really not a big deal. It is part of the package if something is already so important. Although, I wish that in our 20-some years of marriage, we're going on 24 now, I wish I had learned these lessons earlier, because it really would have, I think we could have gelled, we could have flowed in life so much better if I had just followed his lead. I, like many women my generation and younger, was taught to not trust a guy, to not just a guy, but even the person that you marry, to not trust him. And what happens is that you lose that connection, number one. And number two, you don't have the respect that is needed to put order into a relationship. So it took me quite a while, but I finally get it. And that my husband actually said in a recent podcast also, which really pleasantly surprised me, which I'll talk more about later, is that it's not just about the woman submitting to the man, but the couple first needs to submit to the relationship. When you put things in the proper order, then things can much more easily fall into place. And again, like I said, I wish I had learned these years ago, and that's why I'm sharing these lessons like I always do on the Wifey Wake Up podcast, sharing the lessons I wish I had learned earlier. And I think this one really would have helped our relationship run a lot smoother. So first of all, second of all, maybe, I didn't really understand at first that the reason and the value of submission, why it was so valuable. And as my business grew, I definitely understood more and more why it's so important to have a chain of command, why hierarchy is important, why there's the need for submission, but also it's very important to have cooperation. If you can be running a business and be telling people what to do because you're the boss and you're paying them, and they might just be in positional positional leadership relationship and just following you that way. But if you don't cooperate with one another, and you don't even cooperate with your employees or contractors, it will hurt you down the road. And so it's not about in a good working relationship just having someone say yes sir or yes ma'am. It is about having a cooperative relationship. Next, if there isn't a clear person in charge, chaos happens, right? And maybe so. For example, we recently, in the last couple of years, the riots started in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm from Minnesota here, and clearly, when authority was not respected, the chaos ensued, right? And we had areas in Minneapolis that were developing beautifully that still are not as safe to go to as they were before the riots. So just as a point of fact, that if you don't have respect for authority, and that chaos then ensues, right? Eventually, things can get out of hand. So it's just important from an organizational standpoint. Military is another good example of that. I want to emphasize too that submission is always a choice. Now, well, I should say most of the time. Most of us in the free world can move to an area where we may prefer the laws, the customs, the regulations. We can choose the relationships that we want to have. We can choose the people that we want to work with. We might not like the job. Maybe we choose another job that we don't like the work, but we like the people. In our first world way of living, submission is usually a choice. We live still in a free country. We have the ability to influence and change laws and regulations. You can choose, for example, services. You can move to another bank if you don't like their policies or regulations. we don't realize how many things we are actually submitting to on a day-to-day basis, but we still have a choice. And what I want to emphasize is when you're entering into a relationship, particularly a marriage, well, any relationship, but hopefully by the time that you're marrying someone, you have assessed them, you've decided to spend your life with them. And so choosing to submit should go hand in hand with that. And like I said, I was very pleasantly surprised when my husband and I did a podcast on John and Tara podcast that we did a submission series. It actually wasn't planned out. And I was very pleasantly surprised when he said, first, you must submit to the relationship. Then the wife can submit to the husband, and then the husband can submit to the wife. And we'll get into more details about that later. But there needs to be that hierarchy of order, and the relationship in this case needs to be number one. So let's see. Again, submission must come with cooperation for a healthy, loving relationship. No one likes a dictator in the relationship. Okay. Something that I also had to remember is that no one is perfect. So even though I chose to submit, and believe me, this is a day-to-day practice for me. I mean, I was so programmed with feminist ideology that actually I have to, on a case-by-case basis, day-by-day basis, choose to submit, choose to be in cooperation, choose to be in partnership with my husband, because there's so much teaching to be strong, independent, strong-willed, and that is even a plus in a relationship. But really, it's about cooperation. So I really want to emphasize that something that I had to learn and relearn too is it's easy to, when you're shifting your mindset, to go to 180 degrees, right? Really flip it around and realize that submission is not, in this sense, is not acquiescing. It's not just totally giving up. It's not being a child and saying, well, I'm submitting, so you have to do this, right? Everything has to be in cooperation. And even perhaps if you agreed to something, you have to converse like adults and realize that each of you is going to fail. And I'm just going to say in this instance, he's going to fail at times. And maybe things that he promised or maybe implied would happen. And it can feel like when you've submitted to someone that you are putting a lot of responsibility on them, and men are made to take on responsibility. And what we have to remember as women, and those, or even in a position as an employee, for example, is that even though that person has the final say, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. Typically, the more authority that a person has, the more responsibility is on their shoulders. Because if you don't have equal or more authority than the responsibility you have, you are in a weakened position, and no one of a reasonable mind is going to take on more responsibility than they have authority. That's why we see men backing out of situations, out of relationships, out of situations of life, not committing, because they are being forced or cornered into taking on more responsibility without having the authority to make decisions in that relationship, in that situation. So it's really imperative to remember that there are going to be mistakes. So as you're counting on him, it's tempting to go, I can't trust you because this just happened. And this is where you're going to have to really calm down, really have a trusted person to go to. And we'll have to talk about this in another podcast about who can you trust with really difficult things to consider in life, because a lot of people in your life are going to have their own desires for you, and their own desires may not line up with your own desires. And so when he fails, and I say when because we all fail, that is not the cue to back out right away and say, I don't trust you. I cannot listen to you or submit to what you have to say. That's the time to come together even more and discuss and have an adult conversation. And, what I like to say is, put yourself in his shoes. If you had a setback or a failure, would you want your spouse to be backing out right away? And what's challenging about that is when you're in a situation in life that you're already having challenges and the person that's supposed to be by your side the most goes the other direction, goes 90 degrees, it makes it even more difficult. And it makes it hard for them to count on you. And so if you want them by your side, you have to be by their side also. And it's important to have those one-on-one conversations like adults. Submitting doesn't mean that you're a child. Submitting means that you're willing to follow the leadership of a competent human being that you chose to be with, that you deemed was good enough to spend the rest of your life with. So it's important to remember those things. We're talking about partners in life. This is not a dictator to a subject or a child to a parent. This is about two adults working together. So I want to reiterate that if you go to John Terre Podcasts, you can check out our podcast series on our submission series. And we cover that first, the couple must submit to the relationship, number one. Then the wife can submit to the husband, and then the husband can submit to the wife, and what that means in particular. Like I said, I was blown away when my husband started out this series mentioning, the couple must submit to the relationship, and he continues to impress me. And I'm glad that I made the necessary changes to mature to be with him in this way in a relationship, and like I said, choose to submit. So another way to put it is, imagine your marriage as a business, and there has to be a hierarchy of some sort. There's going to be a lot of lateral work. People need to get in a meeting, talk, but someone needs to be the person that's making the final decision. And like mentioned before, the person who's making the final decision, more weight is on their shoulders. So the way I see it is my husband is the CEO of our marriage/business, and I'm the president or COO. And we're definitely both high up there in ranking, but he has a 30,000-foot view. He sees our future. He can see the plans coming along the way. And I'm the COO. I'm the president. I'm like, how can I help? What do we need to bring this together? It has to be about cooperation. And so I can almost not emphasize this enough, but I just want to put this out there and hear from you. I know that submission, I'll tell you, it still makes me cringe sometimes when I hear it, but I know that's because we have been trained to have a different definition of it in our mind, but it's not a bad thing. If we don't submit to the proper authority, we will have chaos in our life. We'll have chaos in our society. And if you don't want chaos in your relationship, there has to be some kind of proper order. And if you got into a relationship, married your spouse because you wanted to married your husband specifically in this situation, because you wanted to live a prosperous life, have a great, quote, marriage business, then you need to have that order, and maybe you need to have the discussion and the agreements of what that means. And I'll tell you, since I have come to understand this, put this into practice, I still get riled up. Okay. There are still times where I'm like, I'm right, you're wrong. This is not how things should be. And then what I do is I make sure to actually talk to him, but in a way that is not, I'm right, you're wrong. It is, okay, this is what I'm thinking. But I also open up and ask him, and he said this really made a world of difference. I've started asking him first, tell me your thought process. Tell me what you're thinking, because I already know. I don't say this part, but I'm saying this in my head. I already know what I'm thinking. So I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, because I love him. I married him. I trusted him enough to commit my whole life to. Why not spend a few minutes and actually hear him out in what he thinks uh, of this situation, what he's thinking, and actually sit and listen in a way to try to understand, not in a way that I'm trying to offer counterpoints, right? And that really has made a big difference. And I'll tell you, there are a few situations where I've actually, even though I still doubted what he was doing, thinking, saying, whatever, I went with it. I just thought, what can it hurt? And then that's a good way to try it out. What's the worst case scenario? And you know what? We're still here. We're doing fine. And like, I learned more from the scenarios as well. And usually that he was right. Yes, John, you were right. And so I really encourage women to give that a try, especially the part about hearing him out without taking the position of trying to present a counter argument, because you're in a marriage not to be at odds, not to be like, if we're equating it to business, you're not competitors, you're partners in business. And you need to have some kind of hierarchy so there isn't chaos internally, so that you can have a successful business, i.e., a successful marriage. So let me know your thoughts, women and men. I'd like to hear from you, and light it up in the comments. I know this is a hot topic, but it is so, so important. And whether it's in a marriage and in our society, in business, but we're applying it to marriage. Let me know, how has it shown up in your life? How have you addressed this issue? Would love to hear from you. Okay, I'll be back tomorrow with more. Take care. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Bye-bye.